occurs.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to continue our discussion of the pandemic, global climate change, and the vulnerable world hypothesis. And I suggested last week that these three topics go together, that in a sense the pandemic has illuminated just how vulnerable our world has become, and that climate change, as bad as the pandemic has been, will be significantly more challenging as we begin to cope with it. We can envision an end to the pandemic, at least an end to the phase in which we've had to take such extreme measures to protect ourselves when we get effective vaccines in a sufficiently large portion of the population. Unfortunately, I don't think climate change, at least I don't currently see the scenario for a technological fix to it. John Campbell actually wrote to me a little bit about this in email. I'll say a little bit more about it later, but I don't think that that's the kind of scenario we're in. And so as opposed to a pandemic where for a year and a half we suffer, but we understand that eventually medical science will create a solution and human behavior can implement that solution, we're in a scenario with climate change in which it's going to get worse, and we're simply going to have to figure out how to mitigate, how to adapt, how to live with the consequences of our present behavior. And so in that sense, the pandemic prepares us and helps us to think about what climate change may be like, and at the same time illuminates a deeper, I think, unifying aspect of these concerns, which is that given the size of the human population on the planet, approaching 8 billion humans, and the level of technological sophistication we have achieved as a species, we are increasingly rendering the world vulnerable. And the world includes us, obviously, and our primary concern may be the extinction of the human species on the planet. That's I think what we have to be, in a sense, most concerned with. But also we should be also deeply concerned with the extinction of other forms of biological life on the planet. And we are in the middle of, to use Elizabeth Colbert's phrase, the sixth great extinction. And this is the first great extinction that is caused by a single species. It is caused by our activity on the planet. So to refresh a little bit, I am drawing heavily on the work of a contemporary philosopher, Nick Bostrom. And Nick Bostrom suggested around a decade ago that we don't spend enough time thinking about what he called global catastrophic risks or existential risks, in part because this is a relatively new phenomenon. It has not been the case throughout most of human history that we as a species have been in a position to eradicate ourselves completely, or even worse, to eradicate life on the planet, to make the planet unhospitable for life as such, uninhabitable, as people sometimes say now. And so that we need to focus our attention in particular on those risks that are most grave in terms of their intensity, they're terminal, and most widespread in terms of their scope. They're global and transgenerational. And that as bad as a pandemic is, it generally does not fit that model. We need to be really concerned about that upper right quadrant of the terrain of risks. And then Bostrom, in a more recent paper, just a little bit more than a year ago, suggested that we now live in a vulnerable world, that human beings have transitioned the world. We have changed the world from being a resilient planet to being a vulnerable world, one in which there was really nothing we could do, no matter how bad, that would endanger life on the planet, to being one in which we can fairly reliably do things that endanger the planet, which is to say, launch a nuclear war, for instance. But Bostrom in particular suggested that this is not just a problem with technologies deliberately made to be destructive, it's a more systematic problem with technological development, that we may be unleashing, for instance, gene editing technology, and the right vaccines that we are currently using that have proved to be the safest and most effective were created using gene editing technology. Clearly, it has good uses, but it might also have some disastrous consequences if we continue to experiment with it in an uncontrolled way. And so part of Bostrom's claim is that civilization as it's existed up until now, in which we let people do whatever they want to do in terms of inventing technology, and more or less whatever they want to do in terms of the use of technology, in which we have not developed the capacity to police individual behavior at the minute scale required in order to restrict the use of technology, that civilization is generating this level of vulnerability. And so climate change fits this model, the pandemic fits this model, so too does the pollution of the gene pool with plastics, or the development of artificial intelligence that we don't necessarily know how we can control, or the development of gene splicing technology that allows us to play God with the genome. And so that these are just examples of the way in which Bostrom believes we need to begin getting our heads around the idea that the kind of risk, transgenerational, terminal, global, catastrophic risk that perhaps was the stuff of sci-fi novels, or apocalyptic imaginations in years past, is now the stuff of real technological possibility. And so we have to begin thinking seriously about what we do in light of the dangers our technology presents to us and the size of our population creates for us. And a final bit of review, right? Part of what Bostrom suggests is that we now can, because of our technology, intervene in systems that make it hard even to predict exactly what the effect of our intervention will be. And so, right, various ecosystems are interconnected in complex ways. Global climate systems have similar properties, and arguably so too do food chains and other forms of biological connectivity. And so, as opposed to thinking we can make a little change and it will have only a little effect, and then another little change and another little effect, we need to start thinking much more about the way in which systems, once disrupted, become unpredictable. And the metaphors that are used here: tipping points, phase transitions, cascades, and avalanches. I think I spoke last time about the idea of that last snowflake or the clap in the valley causing the avalanche. And, you know, at what point are you going to heat water just enough so that it boils, right? Up until that point, it's just getting warmer, warmer, warmer. All of a sudden, it turns from liquid to gas, right? These are not changes that are easily predicted. And so there's a radically increased potential that we unleash processes that we cannot control. Finally, and this is precisely where we left off, we have evolved and contrived modes of thinking and acting, cultures and worldviews, systems of government that really do not reflect a world in which we can have systemic, unpredictable effects at a planetary scale. And so I want to say a little bit more about the background to the ways in which we think and why it is that the ways in which we think may not equip us to solve these problems. And I've pointed out that Nick Bostrom is the head of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. And you might ask, well, why a philosopher? Obviously, understanding the future of human nature has philosophical dimensions to it, but so too does trying to figure out why we're having a hard time coming to grips with our new found power. You might say our almost godlike planet power, at least at a planetary scale. And so Bostrom, I believe, is influenced by some important recent work in philosophy and psychology on the way in which reasoning works and is structured. And this is also rooted in cognitive science, the study of the brain. I've spoken with you before about Daniel Kahneman's very influential work, Thinking Fast and Slow. It is the basis for the Nobel Prize that Kahneman won in economics, despite the fact that he is a psychologist. The reason being that his work became foundational for perhaps the most productive branch of contemporary economics, behavioral economics, and helped us to understand why the idea of neoclassical economics, that humans are just rational utility calculators, is not, in fact, an accurate way to model human economic behavior. And what Kahneman said, to review very quickly, is that human cognition is characterized as having two systems, and right, one of them is a fast system and one of them is a slow system. He refers to them as system 1 and system 2, and system 1 tends to work fairly automatically, unconsciously, effortlessly, right? You're walking down the street and you see somebody coming and you move out of the way a little bit. That's system 1 at work. You don't even give it much thought, right? And it has great advantages, which is to say it allows us to navigate the world at the speed at which the world moves. It allows us not to expend all our energy solving problems that, in a sense, we already have the intuitive solutions for. It allows us to reserve some of our mental energy then for things that are more significant and important. But it also has certain disadvantages. And the term that Kahneman uses is bias or prejudice, or more precisely heuristic, that the way in which system 1 allows us to process information so quickly and jump to conclusions so readily is by using shortcuts and assumptions that generally don't get us into too much trouble. But the question is whether those heuristics are sometimes relied on in situations in which they are not applicable. And I think the last time I spoke with you about Kahneman's work, it was in the context of thinking about bias in policing and criminal justice, and the idea that in American culture, we've come to associate danger and criminality with African American men of a certain age. And so this heuristic that a person who looks like that is a potential threat or criminal has obviously not served us well, right? That's a topic for perhaps returning to on another day, but that's, I think, a very clear illustration. And in the present case, one of the things I think that Kahneman might add to Bostrom's analysis is that it's really hard to pull ourselves out of our long established habits of thought. In order to do so, we have to go over to a second system of cognition that is slower, deliberative, conscious, and uses logic and evidence as opposed to shortcuts and intuitions, and causes us to really reason things out. And it clearly has some advantages. Kahneman suggests among them is monitoring system one to make sure it's not systematically misleading you, but it also allows you to be creative and logical, and to get yourself out of some of the boxes you may have painted yourself into. But it's slow and it's hard, and many people resist doing it, right? And so we are going to, if we're going to cope with global catastrophic risk and the vulnerable world where we're creating, we're going to have to modify our assumptions, our intuitions, our habitual way of reasoning, and we're going to have to reframe our entire world view with regard to risk. And that's not going to be easy work. And so one thing I completely agree with Bostrom about is that we're not going to do this easily. We should not anticipate that we're going to wake up one morning and say, oh my goodness, the planet is hotter, we got to do something about it, right? This is going to take more than just the realization that the processes we've unleashed are endangering us. And part of the problem, in ways I'll get into a minute or two from now, is that the global greenhouse gases that we release this year may not actually have their full effect in terms of the way they warm the planet or the disruptions in various climatary or ecosystems that causes for another 50 or 100 years, right? That there's a lag to the actual effect. And that means that, in a sense, not only do we have to get better at thinking in a way we haven't thought, we also need to anticipate in ways that we're not accustomed to long-range effects of present action. Now, the other work, which I haven't talked with you about before, maybe in some future lecture we can drill into this a little deeper, is a recent book by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. And it's called The Enigma of Reason. And they offer an evolutionary account of the development of the capacity to reason that suggests we're mistaken if we think the capacity to make complex arguments, to think through the solution to problems, to lay out deductively why it is we believe what we believe, right? All of that subsumed under the general category of reasoning. We're deeply mistaken if we think that that developed as a problem-solving capacity. On Mercier and Sperber's account, it developed much more as a way of displaying two aspects of social status. One of them was that you are the kind of person who can do this, right? Where it is often the case that only someone who is trained in complex reasoning is able to display complex reasoning. And so that if this is reserved for high status individuals, being able to do this is a way of marking yourself as a high status individual. And secondly, if cultures and societies and tribes, and generally speaking, social groups are integrated by complex mythic systems, right? Religions, cultures, worldviews, accounts of peoplehood and history, then the capacity to reproduce the myth that makes you belong to your people is an essential capacity of social belonging. And when we get into this in a moment, part of what I will argue is in the United States at present, affirming or denying that climate change exists or that it's created by humanity, that our activity generates it, has become a kind of tribal issue. And if reason is not just a way of arguing and convincing people, if it is in fact a way of displaying tribal belonging, then we can perhaps better understand why it is that when we try to convince those who are not yet convinced, oftentimes it backfires. It just shows that we're not on the team they're on. I noticed that there was a comment in the chat, so I'm going to go take a look. Do you know the artist and title of the art on the cover slide? Why, yes, I do. That's Thelonious Bosch, but I don't know the particular work of art. And that's from Liz, by the way. You're probably familiar with Bosch from his triptychs, like the one that shows hell and earth and heaven. So I chose Bosch because he's particularly good at, in my mind, at evoking a kind of hell on earth scenario. And I'm afraid that what Nick Bostrom is asking us to conceive is that we may be doing things that is going to make Earth pretty hellish pretty soon. All right, as long as I'm out of the PowerPoint, let me ask, do you have any questions about what I've covered so far, right? And I'm about to get into some more details on climate change. It won't be the first time I've spoken with you about this, but I did want to get a new kind of philosophical framework for thinking about climate change before getting into the details of what's happening with climate change in 2021. Any questions at this point? Neither seeing nor hearing anyone. I want to make sure, Marion, you are trying to ask a question. Go ahead.
I'm trying to ask a question.
Okay.
What you didn't mention is some of the things that are very concrete that we might think about, and it's come up before in society, and that is the limiting of our reproduction. Not going to what the Chinese did with just one child per couple, because that would take care of the race very quickly. But two kids per couple worldwide as a regulation so that a substantial number would decrease.
Okay, Marion, and it's interesting. I thought you might have been going someplace else with this, and I'll indicate in a moment where I thought you might be going. But last week I showed some slides which showed global population growth, right? And the way in which it took off in the 19th century and really accelerated in the 20th century. So we've gone from probably an average of no more than 200 million humans on Earth for maybe the last 20,000 years to having 7.7 billion humans on Earth. And clearly, even if we weren't, I mean, one of the things to say is we never would have reached that level of population without our technology. We would have been stuck in the Malthusian trap had we not figured out how to make fertilizers and other aspects of industrial agriculture, right? And so on the one hand, technology and population are connected to each other, but on the other hand, just the sheer fact that we have that many people means that we are going to have much more of an impact on the planet. Clearly, that's an extremely important variable, right? But having said that, I also showed a slide that showed actually population growth is decelerating and decelerating pretty rapidly, and that by the end of this century, we may get to a steady state in terms of human population. And I think it's worthwhile noting what's driving that. And I think there are two things driving it. The first is increases in life expectancy, particularly the survivability of childhood, right? And if people know their children are going to survive, they have fewer children. And secondly, the fact that we're moving away from an agricultural subsistence economy. And so when you have an agricultural subsistence economy, children are a really important economic resource. You need people to work the fields, right? Nowadays, in many respects, having children is an economic burden more than it is an economic resource, right? Because as we live in a more knowledge intensive economy, it costs a lot of money to sustain and educate your children until they're ready to enter the workforce. And so for both of those reasons, it appears that this is, in a sense, happening naturally. Whether we need to be more aggressive in making contraception available to women in different parts of the world, right? The places where the birth rate is still, quite substantial, higher than the replacement rate. Whether we're talking about Africa or Indonesia or Pakistan or India, that has become a smaller problem. It's not become a global problem, although adding another billion people to the planet before we level off is clearly going to make this a problem. Now, let me just say where I thought you were going to go, Marion. And there's recent research out, and I'll just smile as I say this. Have you seen this, that male genitalia are shrinking, as is the sperm count? This is not just a human thing, right? This is occurring across a variety of animal species. And it's not clearly understood yet, but it does appear that it's related, or at least one theory is that it's related to plastics in the gene pool, right? And so another aspect of global planetary risk is that we use so much plastic, right? And so much of it ends up in the oceans or the water tables that it then ends up in almost every living thing. And it's usually so-called microplastic. It's broken down to a microscopic level, and a fair bit of it ends up in the gene pool, in the genomes of the various species on the planet. And there's a question: could this interfere with reproduction? And at first, when you spoke, I thought maybe you were saying that would be another global planetary risk, right? Would be if we suddenly lost the capacity to reproduce, or if we became less capable of reproducing. And there are scientists who are worried that we're seeing initial signs that that is occurring as well, right? So that would be, in a sense, the opposite of the Malthusian nightmare, a sudden loss of reproductive capacity. All right, Marion, thank you for the question. And anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to say something.
This sounds like, is it Matt or Bob? I can't tell.
It's Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Yeah. You use the second person, we, our, us. And I think that when you're talking about the way people think, maybe Kahneman's right, maybe all of us, we humans, do that. But as soon as you start talking about world problems that have to be solved by us, there are an awful lot of different people that have very different ideas about that. And it's a whole different week.
Completely right. And I do want to say something more about that, Matt. And so the we in question in my first person plural in this context is the human species, right? Yeah, and so all of us are endangered. And it doesn't matter whether we use system 1 or system 2, whether we just think in the same ways where we start really wrestling with these problems. If nuclear winter is unleashed, if 50% of Europe becomes uninhabitable due to coastal erosion and desertification, we are all in trouble, right? Even those of us who've been saying for 50 years, we got to do something about us, we're in trouble too, right? But then there's the second we, the we who might solve this. And that's those of us who are convinced that this is a problem, right? And I think I mentioned a little bit last week about the difference between trying to convince the unconvinced and trying to convince the already convinced to make this a serious, perhaps first priority in their politics and their lives, right? And in a sense, I'm convinced at this point that perhaps the second approach is the better approach. That as opposed to trying to convince the people who are recalcitrant or who, for reasons of tribal partisan identity, are unwilling to consider the idea that climate change is real and that we are causing it, it may be inefficient, to say the least, to try to convince them. They may not be part of the us, the we, that is going to solve this problem. Maybe it's more efficient to and more realistic, more practical, and we the human species don't have a lot of time to start getting this right and being more active and constructive. Maybe those of us who are convinced need to concentrate on getting all of us together and saying, we are not going to accept politics as usual. We're not going to be satisfied with a slow walk on this issue. This is something that requires action today, a sprint, not a gradual approach. And so the point is well taken, Matt. And in a sense, I think I may have more to say about it, but I think it's very important to think about who can be convinced in the short term that action is absolutely essential, and whether those people, if you can get them to take it up a level in their priorities, might be sufficient to generate the level of collective action we require on this. Thank you for the good question, Matt. Anybody else before I get back into the presentation? All right, so let me move back then to some of the problems with the way in which we think. And I want to just go very quickly into a few of the heuristics that tend to be at work in human thought that make system one powerful, fast, easy, but also sometimes misleading. So there's so-called confirmation and disconfirmation biases. And this is the idea that it's a lot easier to understand new information if it supports what you already believe, and that it's a lot harder to change your mind on the basis of new information if changing your mind doesn't just mean, oh, I thought that when I saw the empty sign I could go 50 more miles and it turns out I can only go 30 more miles, right? That doesn't involve changing anything else but that one idea, but involves changing a whole framework of cognition, right? Wait a sec. The way in which I've led my whole life, if I continue it and if I encourage my children and my grandchildren to live their lives that way, that will actually contribute to a global catastrophe. That involves, right, changing just more than just one idea, right? And so that new information that challenges an entire received set of categories and presuppositions often is dismissed or processed in a way that leads to it being marginal and not challenging those central ideas or the way in which they're organized. This is closely related to motivated reasoning, and then this comes back to, right, the arguments of Mercier and Sperber, and the idea that we actually tend to reason not from the so-called tabula rasa that John Locke postulated, which is to say, with an open mind, a blank slate, let's just figure out what the right way to solve this problem is. We only reason well, many of us, when we already have something we want to demonstrate. And so in a sense, the conclusion generates the supporting argument, not vice versa. And so it's the inverse of what you would be taught in a logic class. The intergroup bias, that people like you are in the right, in the know, in the good for the most part, and that people who are unlike you are on the opposite end of those evaluations. And just to be clear, this is actually tightly connected with a sense of self-worth, because oftentimes you bolster your self-worth by thinking that people like you are worthy as well. And if it turns out that you're part of a group that's doing something bad, it can be not just damaging to your sense of belonging, but also damaging to your sense of self-worth. I'm going to skip to solution bias, and this is the one that I think may be most pertinent in this context. And this is the tendency to believe if there's a problem, there must be a solution. And if there's a solution, then in a sense, we will figure it out. We will get there, right? And this is, in a sense, a powerful Enlightenment conviction. It's given us an enhanced sense of agency over the world, but it's also just absolutely not the case. The universe is built this way, right? And so we need to be very careful. And what John sent an email to me about was the idea that if we're really this far along in causing global climate change, even if we somehow miraculously over the next decade get to a carbon neutral economy on a global scale, and I'll talk more about that, but right, we're at the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. I think most people who study this think this is the critical decade, the decade in which it's both technologically possible and absolutely environmentally necessary to, quote, decarbonize the economy, to stop putting carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere alongside other greenhouse gases. That even if we succeed at that very ambitious goal, it may be that some of the processes that we've unleashed will nevertheless do catastrophic damage at the global scale. Maybe we need to start thinking about engineering the planet, right? And I'll just skip ahead here for a second, since I'm talking about this, to some of the books that I find to be most helpful on this. And if anybody is interested, I can email this list to Amy, and she can share them with you. But the book I want to talk about, and you can see that Elizabeth Kolbert is on this book list twice. You may know her from the New Yorker. You might also know her other recent book that probably could be on this list also, The Sixth Great Extinction, which I referred to a few minutes ago. But the new book is called Under a White Sky: The Nature of the Future. And the argument of this book is that we need to be very careful about the idea of geoengineering, right? Trying to change the planet in order to mitigate or reverse global climate change. And so one idea would be to somehow or other create a layer in the sky that would bounce a lot of the solar energy out away from the planet. And among other things, she said that would mean the end of sunshine as we know it, right? We wouldn't have blue skies, we would have white skies from here on out. But the point that Elizabeth Kolbert is making in this book, to simplify, but to make it as direct and concise as possible, is that we need to be cautious about our systemic effects. The ecosystems of the earth, what's sometimes called the Gaia system of the earth, the overall interconnectivity of all systems on the planet, these are things that sometimes we have to admit we don't understand very well. And if we start putting new algae in the ocean that eat the carbon out of the atmosphere, or we start seeding the sky with new kinds of clouds, we might do all kinds of other things beyond what we intend to do that might be similarly catastrophic. And so again, I want to say, and unfortunately, we're in a world of difficult choices here. We need to be careful and recognize that the solution bias is a bias. So with all that in mind, right, the background to Bostrom's thesis is that we need to change the way in which not only we regulate human behavior, but also the way in which we think about problems. Now, let me move ahead and I'm sorry, start talking. Yeah, here we go. Again, about the coronavirus for a minute, and the way in which the coronavirus are is illuminating our capacity for global collective action in ways that may be important, and for not only bringing the pandemic under control, but for also taking effective action on climate change. And so the first point I want to make is that it is essential, right, that each of us do everything we can. I'm trying so hard to eliminate plastics from my life. It's impossible, given how much stuff comes wrapped in everything. I guess I could go back to the earth or back to the land. I'm not willing or able to do that, but I am doing my best. And it's not easy. It's actually easier in California than it is in New York, given some of the statutes. And that's, I think, a really important point, right? Which is to say that individually, each of us can and should do everything that's possible, right? And that may actually have a significant impact if we all wear masks, if we all maintain social distance, if we all sequester after we've been exposed. The pandemic would be a lot less bad than it is. The fact that we are, many of us, doing these things has shown our capacity to produce change at a national or even a global scale through our individual actions. And so that's the first thing I want to notice about the connection between the pandemic and climate change, is that this has required individual action and sacrifice in order to address a global problem. It is, in certain respects, a model for dealing with climate change and other aspects of global pandemic risk. And at the same time, it is illuminating the insufficiency of purely individual action. We need laws, we need regulation, and we need support, right? If you're really going to ask people to sequester after they've been exposed, and at the same time, they are so economically vulnerable that they can't afford not to work, then you need to make resources available to them. Now, going back to the idea of how to shape public opinion, and this has, I think, been one of the things that's been really illuminating about the pandemic, which is to say countries in which leaders and the entire political establishment have come together to say, this is real and this will kill you and we've got to do something about it, but what we've got to do may not be that unbearable if we do it together and distribute the costs in a fair way, especially societies like Japan, for instance, that acted on the basis of sound science from the beginning, have had a lot of success, right? And so shaping public opinion is very important. And the model that I would suggest to you is this model of exponential spread of opinion, of ideas. If we look at what's happened with gay marriage in the United States in the last 20 years, right? Going from a period not too long ago where the Supreme Court upheld a Texas statute that said the police could invade your bedroom if they thought that you were engaged in sodomy and arrest you, right, for violating community standards, to a period in which the Supreme Court has said, guess what? Gay marriage is the law of the land. And you got to get used to it, just in the same way that you had to get used to separate but equal is inherently unconstitutional. And we as a society, in fact, paved the way for that change by changing our minds. And so changing minds can be a powerful form of political action. And if each person persuades two persons to change their minds or to act differently, very quickly, if that continues, if those two people then persuade two more each, et cetera, and so on, very quickly you are on your way to a sea change in public opinion. And as I've said, the evidence out there that the most effective way to do this is not by trying to convince those who are not convinced that climate change is real or that it's generated by human activity, but instead trying to convince those who say, yeah, climate change is real, but I got other things to worry about, that they're making a mistake, a catastrophic mistake in not attaching sufficient importance and priority to something that could ultimately make the world uninhabitable for their children. Final idea here, motivated interviewing. The idea that as opposed to trying to change somebody's mind, if you're going to take the second approach and not just try to convince those who are already persuaded to be more active on this issue, but instead to convince those who are not yet persuaded that motivated interviewing might be more important or more effective. And the idea here is not to try to convince someone that they're wrong, but to spend more time trying to figure out what they care about, why they think what they think, and whether there isn't perhaps some inconsistency, some toehold for getting them to think differently, right? And at the same time being open to the idea that there's a coherence and a rationality to the way in which they think, trying to understand the way in which they view the world. And I'll just briefly mention that one of the things, and there's been scholarship about this recently, I think it's been picked up in the popular press as well, one of the approaches here is in fact to concentrate on women, and women who are mothers, and women who have built their lives around caring for their children and preparing their children to do well in the world, and to ask them, well, what if the world that your children are going to inhabit is going to be a much more difficult world than the one we inhabit? What if it's going to be one in which it's going to be much harder to lead the kind of life that we lead? Would that be all right with you? And if there's a risk that that's the case, wouldn't what you're doing right now lead you to perhaps also want to do other things to make sure that your children will have a safe future on this planet? And so having said that, I want to conclude this little bit of the lecture by saying, I'll talk for a moment about Bill McKibben. Some of you may know, one of the leading thinkers on global climate change, writes for the New Yorker a fair bit now, was and in many respects still is an environmental radical, and for many years had been fairly pessimistic. He thought that we had already reached the level of carbon parts per million in the atmosphere that made climate change irreversible and disastrous. And just recently, I've been noticing a change in tone in his writing. And in particular, what he is suggesting is that for the first time in his, I think it's practically 50-year career in thinking about this, that he is noticing that the technology has got to the point where we can, in fact, envision sustaining something like our standard of living while radically reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that we put into the environment. And the issue here is that solar energy, wind energy, electric motors, and battery storage have all gotten so much better in the last decade that you can really see not only sustaining a modern high-tech civilization on the basis of clean energy, but also perhaps maintaining something like our way of life, driving cars, but those cars now will be electric vehicles as opposed to gas-powered vehicles, etc. Right? And so all that to say, we're clearly not going to get to the place. And you may have seen that the Biden administration has set as its objective that the automobiles driven in the United States by 2050 be uniformly electrical vehicles, right? And we're not going to get there unless we basically are only selling electric vehicles by 2035. Right, and that's how long it will take the gas vehicles to cycle out of the fleets of Americans nationwide. And that means, guess what? Right now, we've got to really strongly encourage our automobile manufacturers, perhaps require our automobile manufacturers to start transitioning their fleets. And so, yes, systematic, ambitious political action is possible and indispensable now, and we've got to do it. And as I showed a little bit last time, the climate of public opinion has actually changed in important ways that make this possible. 90% of Democrats and 40% of Republicans believe that the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. That means that overall, 2/3 of Americans believe this. There's clearly a sharp partisan divide, and that's something I'm going to speak about in a moment. But nevertheless, we're up to a clear majority, including a substantial portion of Republicans thinking that more needs to be done. And that is because a substantial majority, nearly 2/3 of Americans, think that climate change is affecting the communities in which they live, including 22% who say a great deal. These are probably people who live in fire belts or coastal communities or places affected by hurricanes. And while we have to get more traction on turning that general conviction into particular policy proposals, we are starting to get there, right? And so if you look, when it comes to solar panels, 81% of conservative Republicans believe that there should be more solar panel farms, more wind turbines, 70%, right? And so there are things that we could be doing here and now that we can do. But having said all of that, I want to point out one other aspect to this, and that is what I'm going to call the stickiness of American politics, that you can't just take an issue like climate change and try to pull it off to the side and say, let's focus on this and this alone. Why is it that climate change became a culture war issue? Why is it that it became a point of partisan polarization in which to say that you think climate change is real, that it's caused by human action, that we need to do something about it, marks you out as a Democrat or a liberal? And please note that that wasn't the case as recently as a decade ago. And you know this diagram, I hope, right? I've shared it with you before in the context of a long lecture series on inequality in the United States. And this shows you, right, what's happened to economic inequality, income inequality. The top 1% have done fabulously well as we've transitioned away from a manufacturing industrial economy into a financialized knowledge economy. And the bottom 50% have been totally left out of those economic gains. Their economic standing has not even kept pace with the rate of growth of the economy as a whole, right? Fallen substantially below it. And I do think there's a sense in which those who say climate change is not real are saying two things at once. One of them is, I have more urgent problems. I'm having trouble maintaining my mortgage, paying my rent, paying my medical bills, feeding my children, right? Don't talk to me about something that's gonna maybe be a problem 50 years from now. I have urgent problems today I've got to solve, right? And the second thing they're saying is, you know, who is it that really cares about climate change? It's the people who have good educations, the people who are therefore doing better in this economy and who have shown, frankly, rather little concern about the fact that people like me are struggling. You want to convince me about climate change? You better start listening to me about the way in which the economic changes from which you have benefited have rendered me vulnerable, right? Once you do that, maybe I'll start listening to you. And so this is a tricky and difficult point. It's the point on which I'll conclude today. If we care a lot about climate change, then we've got to look to figure out where the resistance to doing something about it comes from. And yes, it comes from the Koch brothers who profit substantially from drilling oil out of the ground and putting into our cars, which is one of the primary ways in which greenhouse gases end up in the atmosphere. But it also comes from lots of people who don't have a vested interest in pollution per se, but who do feel that the kind of people who care about climate change are not like them and frankly are somewhat indifferent or even hostile to them. All right, so I will stop there, and I am open to whatever questions, comments, thoughts you might have. Who wants to start us out today?
Well, I'll start it out by saying that when it comes to the geoengineering, we, meaning Western people, basically don't have any control over what other people do. The Chinese could do geoengineering for the entire world, and it would annoy some people and it would make other people happy, but they don't really have to ask anybody's permission. It's a sort of situation where cooperation is not necessarily required, is my point.
Yeah, fair enough. And this is going back to Nick Bostrom. One of the reasons he believes we need much stronger instruments of global governance. And I have to say, I wasn't able to talk about this today. I think I'm going to leave this off here because there's so much else in the world that we could be talking about. And obviously, these are topics we could be talking about for a long time. The vulnerability of the world, technology, climate change. But Bostrom believes we need much stronger instruments of world governance precisely to constrain what we do with technology and not to make us dependent upon what any libertarian or rogue regime might allow its citizens or its scientists to do. And we can think here, right, of genetic engineering and the experiments that have been done in Korea and China on this as examples, right? But your point is very well taken, Matt. And I guess I would just say, um, if we're going to think about geoengineering, and there are proposals that seem to me to be perhaps the right kind because they're reversible, right? And that would be involve putting large satellites with large banks of mirrors in the stratosphere and letting them serve as temporary heat shields, right? And so if the Earth's atmosphere starts to retain heat to such a degree that we're really in trouble, and if we don't develop the capacity to pull the carbon back out of the atmosphere, right, which is one of the big frontiers of scientific research, and in a sense that would be a geoengineering project maybe, but it would probably be the kind we all favor, right? Get us back to the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere that we've had for most of the last 10,000 years, right? And actually quite a bit earlier than that. And I can show you what I'm talking about for a moment, because I think this is quite striking. This is, right, a diagram that correlates the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, parts per million, and the global planetary temperature, right? And as I've tried to indicate, there's a lag, right? The temperature is a so-called lagging indicator. The carbon level goes up first, and then the temperature follows. And what this diagram shows is that there's a very strong correlation between the level of carbon in the atmosphere and the heat on the surface of the planet, the temperature on the surface of the planet. And it also shows, by the way, look at what has happened in the last 100 years, right? And please note that the time scale here is, let me get this right, 600,000 years, right? So that blue line at the end, that represents maybe a century on this scale. We have exceeded the highest level in the recent history of the planet, thinking of this in geological time, right? And so maybe eventually, it's hard to know for sure, but there's certainly a lot of energy being put into the idea of developing technologies that could pull some of that carbon back out of the atmosphere, put it back into the earth, and prevent us from having to be permanently on a planet that gets overheated by solar energy. But until then, maybe we put satellites in the sky that have mirrors, and then we can take them down when we no longer need them, or reposition the mirrors when we are not suffering adverse consequences. That's not a bad approach, but the approach, and this is, I think, what Matt has in mind, where we seed the oceans with carbon-eating algae, or we seed the skies with minerals that are reflective, that stuff may be really hard to reverse and may have all kinds of unintended consequences. And you're right, Matt, to say on the one hand, that if China decides to do it, if India decides to do it, we may not be able to stop them. And on the other hand, if they decide to do it, the effects are almost certainly not going to be confined to their part of the globe, right? They're going to be global effects. So yes, this is another complexity in this problem. Suzanne, did you want to ask a question?
Oh, but Frosty goes.
So
you hear me?
so who's that speaking?
This is Suzanne.
Go ahead, Suzanne, and then I'll get to you, Flossie.
I'm just wondering what you think American history teaches us with regard to the duality that you just laid out between a more open view that we can solve some of these problems and a more negative view or pessimistic that we're too polarized for that to work. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, and it's a great question, and I'm kind of trying to think it through as you're asking it. Let me say two things, and the first is that the whole jumping off point of these couple lectures is that history is not very good as guidance for thinking through climate change, right? And so in American history, with the possible exception of the nuclear arms race in the Cold War, we really haven't faced this kind of problem before, right? And I think I might have shared this with you. The literature that I was reading and getting ready for this suggests that there have been 8 times between basically the late 1940s and the late 1960s when the US was on the brink of nuclear war, either because of something happening here or something happening in the Soviet Union. And that in each of those 8 occurrences, there was practically a 50-50 chance that we would have gone to war. And if you add those probabilities together, it means the likelihood that there was going to be nuclear war during the Cold War was actually very high. And we got very lucky. Because not until the late 1960s, early 1970s, did we understand that launching a intercontinental nuclear war wasn't just going to destroy North America and the Soviet Union. It was probably going to destroy life on the planet because of all the debris that would be put in the atmosphere and what it would do, choking out the sun, a so-called nuclear winter for possibly a decade or longer, right? So our history doesn't suggest that we've been lucky as opposed to good at addressing problems like this. But the second issue then you're pointing out, and this is one, of course, I've spoken with you about recently, is that we have a different kind of political polarization today. It's not the case that we're just polarized, but that our polarization is organized on partisan lines. We're sorted into more ideologically pure parties, and that makes it harder then to work with each other or to have compromise or bipartisanship. And I can only hope that as a generational turnover occurs, and again, I didn't get a chance to drill down on this evidence, but the evidence is very clear that the younger you are, the more likely you are to take climate change seriously. And that as Republicans begin to have to compete for younger voters, they're going to have to change their tune on climate change. But all that to say, this is not saying we've done this before and we'll do it again. It's saying this is really new and really hard and going to require entirely unprecedented ways of thinking and acting. All right, Flossie and then Bob, and then I am going to have to call it a day. Flossie, I guess I can see you up there on the 8th floor, right?
A reminder that a book called The Children of Men by a lady who is now deceased but wrote wonderful detective books imagines a world where the community, mostly white communities, have grown infertile. And so children are no longer conceived, not because people are not trying, but the sperm bank or something has gone wrong. It's a scary book, but it was a deeply religious person. And so finally, one of the fighting young people who wants to do something about stopping the world from starving by taking old people out to sea and drowning them, comes up with an immaculate, not an immaculate conception, but a miraculous conception. What she leaves out is the possibility that this was an opportunity for this community to adopt children, only there are no longer children to adopt. So it's a scary world, but fiction sometimes imagines what can happen, but doesn't take it as far as Huxley did in Brave New World, where we come out of test tubes. Just a reminder, the English teacher wants to flirt. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Flossie, and I completely agree that fiction, the imagination, may be necessary, right? And I'll just point out to you, I imagine you're aware, there was actually a movie made on the basis of that novel. And so when I think of the kids I teach today, it's probably going to get to them a lot quicker and a lot more of them if it's visualized, if they can watch it on a screen and not just have to read the book. Bob, I'll give you the last question for the day. You've got to unmute yourself. I think you know that, right?
Just a subtle ray of hope. I was just reflecting on the fact that 30 years ago, my kids are in school. They were learning about the evils of smoking. And they came home and gave me hell. And I quit smoking back then. And just thinking about where that movement has gone since that time, and now you can't smoke in most restaurants and it's the young people. If you get the young people involved in moving in the right direction, I think it's a lot of hope.
Yeah,
very hopeful.
Great point, Bob. And I will tell you very quickly how much I agree with you. I live in a community that does not have curbside composting, right? And I actually compost and drive it to a dump every week, and I hurt my back doing it a few weeks ago. And so I've been thinking about how to get the community, which by the way does twice a week garbage pickup, which just makes no sense at all as far as I'm concerned. And so I've decided the way to do this is I'm going to try to get myself invited to the local high school and to convince the high school students that we need curbside composting much more than we need twice a week garbage removal, and see if maybe I can get them to be thorns in their parents' side to the point where maybe the city council eventually does something. All right, everybody, great being with you. Take care and look forward to seeing you next week. Amy, if you're still here, I will get you the list of new topics pronto. Liz, I can see you're still here. I'm going to try to get you the title for that painting if I can still find it. All right, everybody, take care. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan.
Bye-bye.